September 8, 1941. Dawn breaks over Leningrad, Soviet Union's second-largest city, home to 3 million people who woke up this morning to find themselves surrounded. German Army Group North has captured Shlisselburg on Lake Ladoga. The last land route into the city is cut. The railroads are severed. The highways are blocked. Leningrad is isolated from the rest of the Soviet Union, trapped between the German army to the south and west, Finnish forces to the north, and Lake Ladoga to the east. The siege has begun, though nobody yet knows it will last 872 days and kill over 1 million people. Adolf Hitler stands in his headquarters studying maps of the Eastern Front. Planning Leningrad's destruction, he's issued orders that the city must not be captured but destroyed. The Wehrmacht will surround it and starve the population. Artillery will shell it continuously. The Luftwaffe will bomb it daily. When everyone inside is dead, the ruins will be leveled and the land given to Germany. Hitler wants Leningrad erased because it's the birthplace of Bolshevism, the city where Lenin led the 1917 revolution. Symbolic target whose destruction will demoralize the Soviet people and prove German superiority. The residents of Leningrad don't know about Hitler's extermination plans. They know the Germans are close. They hear artillery in the distance. They see smoke from fires in the suburbs. But Stalin's propaganda assures them the Red Army will drive the fascists back, that the siege is temporary, that food supplies are adequate. None of this is true. The city has food stocks for maybe 30 days if rationed carefully. There's no plan for feeding 3 million people through a siege of unknown duration. The Soviet leadership hoped to prevent encirclement. Now that it's happened, they're improvised desperately. Dmitri Shostakovich is in Leningrad when the siege begins. The famous composer is writing his 7th symphony. He works during air raids, composing music while bombs fall. His symphony will become the siege's soundtrack, performed in the besieged city in August 1942 by an orchestra of starving musicians, broadcast to the world as proof that Leningrad still lives. But in September 1941, Shostakovich doesn't know if he'll survive long enough to finish it. Nobody knows if the city will survive the month. The first casualties are from German artillery and bombs. Shells fall randomly across the city, hitting apartment buildings and factories and schools. The bombardment is constant. Leningrad's residents learn to recognize the sound of incoming shells. They run for shelters when they hear the whistle. Thousands die in the first weeks from explosions and shrapnel. Buildings collapse, burying families. Fires spread through wooden structures. The dead are buried quickly in mass graves, but the artillery and bombs are just the beginning. The real killer will be hunger. September 1941. The food rationing begins. Workers receive 800 grams of bread daily. Office workers get 600 grams. Dependents and children receive 400 grams. These amounts seem manageable at first. People tighten their belts and expect the siege to end soon. The Red Army is counterattacking. Surely the encirclement will be broken within weeks. But weeks pass and the siege continues. The ration amounts decrease. By November, workers are getting 250 grams of bread daily. About 2 slices. Everyone else gets 125 grams. Less than half a slice. This isn't enough to survive on. People are slowly starving. The bread isn't real bread anymore. It's made from whatever can be ground into flour. Sawdust is added to stretch supplies, cellulose from wallpaper paste, cottonseed cake that's normally animal feed. The bread is black and dense and barely digestible, but it's all there is. People queue for hours in freezing temperatures to receive their daily ration. They clutch their bread cards like they're precious documents because losing your card means death. Some people are murdered for their cards. Theft of ration cards becomes capital crime punishable by immediate execution. October 1941. The weather turns cold. Leningrad winters are brutal even in peacetime. Temperatures drop to -30°C. The city's heating fuel is running out. Coal and wood supplies that were supposed to last the winter are consumed in weeks. Buildings lose heat. Water pipes freeze and burst. People burn furniture to stay warm. They burn books. They strip wood from abandoned buildings. The cold combines with hunger to create killing conditions. The weakest die first, the elderly and the very young, the sick and the injured. Tanya Savicheva is 11 years old when the siege begins. She lives with her large family in Leningrad. She keeps a diary in a small notebook. The entries are brief and terrible. They chronicle her family's destruction. Zhenya died on December 28th at 12:30 in the morning 1941, her sister. Then her grandmother, then her brother, then her uncles, then her mother. The entries continue through 1942, each one recording another death. Finally, just one entry remains. Savichev's died. Everyone died. Only Tanya is left. She's evacuated from the city in 1942. Dies of tuberculosis in 1944. Her diary survives as testimony to what happened. November 1941. People are eating anything. Leather belts are boiled to make soup. The gelatin from bookbinding paste is scraped off and eaten. Pets disappear. First the cats and dogs are eaten. Then the rats, then the crows. The zoo animals are slaughtered for meat, though most died early in the siege from starvation or bombing. Carpenter's glue is dissolved in water and consumed. Lipstick is eaten for its fat content. People chew on birch bark. They make soup from grass and leaves and wood. None of this provides real nutrition. People's bodies consume themselves. Muscles waste away. Organs begin failing. The dead are everywhere. Bodies lie in the streets where people collapsed from exhaustion and froze. There's no energy to bury them properly, no transportation to move them to cemeteries. Corpses are stacked in courtyards like firewood, waiting for spring when the ground thaws enough for burial. The frozen bodies don't decompose in the winter cold. They're just there, constant reminders of death. Children walk past corpses on their way to school. People step over bodies in the street. Death becomes so common it loses its horror. It's just part of life in besieged Leningrad, December 1941. The deaths accelerate. Thousands die daily now, mostly from dystrophy, which is the medical term for starvation. People's bodies shut down organ by organ. The heart muscle weakens, kidneys fail. The immune system collapses, making people vulnerable to diseases that healthy bodies would fight off easily. Dystrophy victims develop a characteristic appearance: skeletal thinness, sunken eyes, swollen legs from edema. They move slowly because they have no energy. They speak quietly because talking requires effort they can't afford, that the water supply fails when pipes freeze. People melt snow for drinking water. They break ice from the Neva River and carry it home in buckets. Carrying water becomes exhausting labor for starving people. Some collapse on the way home and freeze to death beside their water buckets. The lack of running water means no sewage system. Human waste accumulates. Disease spreads. Typhus and dysentery kill people weakened by hunger. The combination of starvation and disease and cold creates death rate, unprecedented in modern warfare. January 1942. The coldest month. Temperatures reach -40°C. The city is frozen and dark. Electricity is rationed to essential facilities. Most homes have no power, no heat, no light. People huddle in their apartments, wrapped in every piece of clothing they own. Entire families sleep in one bed, sharing body heat. The old and the sick die in their sleep and freeze solid. Their families keep the bodies in the apartment because it's too difficult to move them. Sometimes for weeks, frozen corpses share living space with the dying. Cannibalism begins. The subject is taboo even now. Soviet authorities denied it happened during and after the siege. But survivor testimony and NKVD records confirm cases. Desperate people eat the dead. Police find butchered human remains, arrest people for cannibalism. Some are executed, some are imprisoned. The records distinguish between those who ate already dead people and those who murdered for meat. Both happened. The horror of the siege drove some people to unthinkable acts. Most didn't resort to cannibalism. They died instead. But some chose survival at any moral cost. The Leningrad police records document 2,000 arrests for cannibalism during the siege. How many cases went undiscovered is unknown. The police tried to suppress information about cannibalism because it damaged morale. But rumors spread anyway. People whispered about neighbors who disappeared, about meat patties sold in black markets that tasted wrong, about children who vanished. The siege created conditions where civilization's rules broke down, where survival required abandoning normal human behavior. February 1942, the death rate peaks. 100,000 people die this month. Bodies are everywhere, piled in courtyards, stacked in public buildings, lying in the streets. The morgues overflow. There aren't enough living people with enough strength to bury the dead. Spring will reveal mass graves containing hundreds of thousands of corpses. The scale of death is incomprehensible to people experiencing it. Everyone knows dozens of people who've died. Most families have lost members. Some families are completely gone. Empty apartments where entire families starve together. The city's cultural institutions try to maintain some normalcy. The Hermitage Museum stays open, though most of its collection has been evacuated. The curators who remain give lectures to nearly empty galleries. Keeping their minds active helps them survive mentally, though their bodies are failing. Theaters perform for tiny audiences of skeletal people who come to forget their hunger for a few hours. Libraries remain open. People read to escape reality. Culture becomes survival mechanism, proof that they're still human, despite living in hell. The children of Leningrad suffer terribly. They don't understand why there's no food, why they're always hungry, why adults can't help them. Many become orphans when their parents die. Orphanages fill with starving children. The staff try to care for them, but resources are gone. Children die by the hundreds in the orphanages. The smallest victims of the siege, babies born during the siege, rarely survive. Their mothers have no milk. There's no formula. Infants starve within weeks of birth. The schools try to stay open. Teachers conduct classes for students too weak to walk to school. Children study in freezing classrooms, trying to concentrate while hungry and cold. Some collapse at their desks. Some die during class. Education continues because giving up means accepting defeat. The siege won't destroy their future, even as it destroys their present. This determination to maintain civilization despite impossible conditions defines Leningrad's resistance. March 1942. The ice on Lake Ladoga begins to thin. This creates new danger. The lake has been Leningrad's lifeline through the winter. Trucks drive across the frozen lake, bringing supplies from the Soviet rear. This route is called the Road of Life. It's dangerous. German artillery shells the ice. Planes bomb the trucks. Many vehicles break through thin ice and sink with their drivers and cargo. But enough get through to keep Leningrad alive barely. Thousands of tons of food cross the lake. Evacuation of civilians begins. The weakest are sent out first, mostly women and children. The Road of Life is inadequate for feeding 3 million people. It brings enough food to prevent complete extinction, but not enough to prevent mass starvation. The siege continues, the dying continues. But the worst is past. From March 1942 onward, the death rate decreases. Still terrible, but not apocalyptic. People who survived the winter have learned how to exist on minimal calories. They've adapted to starvation. Their bodies are damaged permanently, but they're alive. April 1942. The ice on Lake Ladoga becomes unusable. Too thin for trucks, but not yet melted for boats. This is the most dangerous time. Leningrad is completely cut off until the lake melts. But people have hope now. They survived the winter. Spring is coming. There will be edible plants, dandelions, and nettles, and grass. Not nutritious, but something to fill stomachs. The psychological impact of spring is enormous. Survivors describe feeling hope for the first time in months. May 1942. The city begins cleaning up. The snow melts, revealing the full horror of the winter. Thousands of corpses appear, bodies that were buried in snow. People who died and were left where they fell. The cleanup is massive effort. Weak survivors work to collect and bury the dead. Mass graves are dug. Bodies are collected by the hundreds and buried without ceremony. The city must be cleaned before warm weather brings disease. The work is gruesome but necessary. June 1942. The siege continues, but conditions improve marginally. Food shipments across Lake Ladoga increase. The rations rise slightly. Gardens are planted in every available space. Parks and squares become vegetable gardens. People grow cabbages and potatoes anywhere soil exists. These gardens provide psychological benefit as much as nutritional, giving people something to do, something to hope for. The siege is far from over, but survival seems possible now. July 1942. Preparations begin for performing Shostakovich's 7th Symphony in Leningrad. The composer finished it in Kubyshev, where he was evacuated. But he wrote it for Leningrad. The score is flown into the besieged city. The Leningrad Radio Orchestra will perform it. But the orchestra barely exists. Most musicians are dead from starvation. Others are too weak to play. A call goes out for musicians. Players are recalled from military units. Anyone who can hold an instrument is recruited. August 9, 1942. The 7th Symphony premieres in Leningrad's Philharmonic Hall. The orchestra is makeshift. The musicians are skeletal. Barely able to hold their instruments. They haven't practiced together. Many are playing on instruments borrowed from dead colleagues. But they perform Shostakovich's symphony. The music is broadcast on loudspeakers throughout the city, beamed by radio to the German positions, so the enemy can hear that Leningrad still lives, still creates beauty, still refuses to surrender. The performance is triumph of human spirit. Starving musicians playing complex music, proving that culture survives even in siege conditions. The audience weeps during the performance, not from the music's beauty alone, but from what the performance represents. Leningrad's determination to remain civilized despite being treated like animals. To create art while dying, the symphony becomes the siege's symbol, proof that the city's soul wasn't broken, though its body was shattered. The siege continues through 1942 and into 1943. The dying continues, though, never again, at winter 1941-42 rates. Artillery shells still fall randomly. Air raids still happen. People still starve, but not as catastrophically. The Soviet military launches multiple attempts to break the siege. These offensives fail with terrible casualties. The Red Army's losses trying to relieve Leningrad exceed the city's civilian deaths. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers die in failed attacks against German positions. January 1943. The Soviets finally break through the German encirclement, creating a narrow land corridor south of Lake Ladoga. The corridor is only 8 to 10 kilometers wide, under constant German artillery fire, but it allows a railroad to be built. Supplies can now reach the city by rail instead of only across the lake. This doesn't end the siege, but improves conditions dramatically. Food supplies increase. The starvation rations give way to barely adequate rations. People are still hungry, but not dying from hunger. The siege continues through 1943. The Germans maintain their encirclement. Artillery bombardments continue. People still die from shells and bombs, though starvation deaths decrease. The city begins recovering slowly. Factories resume production, making munitions for the Red Army. Workers who were too weak to stand in 1942 are operating machinery in 1943, evidence of human resilience. The ability to recover from near death with minimal improvement in conditions. January 1944. The Soviet military launches Operation January Thunder. Major offensive to completely break the siege. This time they succeed. German Army Group North is driven back from Leningrad's outskirts. The artillery that shelled the city for 872 days is finally out of range. The siege is broken, though the term siege continues to apply until the Germans are driven completely away. The immediate threat is over. Leningrad is saved. January 27, 1944. The official end of the siege, 872 days after it began. Soviet forces have driven the Germans back. The city celebrates, though the celebration is muted. Too many dead to feel real joy. The survivors are traumatized, physically damaged, emotionally scarred. The siege killed somewhere between 800,000 and 1.5 million people. Exact numbers are uncertain because record-keeping collapsed during the worst periods. Most died from starvation, others from cold, disease, bombing. Shelling got the survivors bear permanent physical damage. The starvation caused lasting health problems. Heart damage, kidney damage, weakened immune systems. Many develop chronic illnesses that persist for life. Women who lived through the siege have difficulty bearing children. Their bodies were so damaged by starvation that reproductive systems never fully recover. The siege's medical legacy affects survivors for decades. The psychological damage is equally profound. Survivors have PTSD, though that term doesn't exist yet. They have nightmares about starvation. They hoard food compulsively. They can't throw away edible food, even when they have plenty. The trauma shapes their behavior for life. Their children and grandchildren inherit the trauma secondhand. Growing up with parents who can't discuss what they experienced, who react with terror to situations that trigger siege memories. The siege's death toll exceeds the total civilian deaths in Britain and the United States combined during the entire war. More people died in Leningrad alone than all British and American civilians killed by bombs and rockets and V weapons. The scale is difficult to comprehend. A single city losing 1 million people in less than 3 years, equivalent to the entire population of a major city dying from starvation and cold and bombardment. Stalin's role in the siege is complicated and damning. He refused to evacuate the city before the encirclement was complete. Hundreds of thousands could have been saved if evacuation had begun when German approach was obvious. Stalin feared that evacuating Leningrad would be interpreted as defeatism, would damage morale. His priority was symbolic resistance, not saving lives. The city had to hold regardless of cost, because surrender was ideologically unacceptable. The Soviet military's attempts to break the siege were poorly planned and wastefully executed. Frontal assaults against prepared German positions produced catastrophic casualties without achieving breakthrough. Red Army losses in the Leningrad sector exceed 1 million killed, wounded, and missing. More soldiers died trying to relieve the siege than civilians died in it, though the civilian suffering was more prolonged and possibly more terrible than combat deaths. The question of whether Leningrad should have surrendered is morally complex. Surrender would have saved lives in the short term. But Hitler's plans for the city were extermination, not occupation. The Germans intended to starve everyone regardless. Surrender might have meant faster death, not survival. The Soviet defenders couldn't trust German promises, given the pattern of Nazi behavior in occupied territories. Resistance was arguably the only option, even though it meant terrible suffering. The siege's strategic impact on the war is debatable. Tying down German forces that could have been used elsewhere had value. Preventing Leningrad's capture denied Germany a major port and industrial center, but the cost in lives was staggering. Whether the strategic benefits justified the casualties depends on how you value human life versus military objectives. Stalin clearly valued the objectives more than the lives. He was willing to sacrifice 1 million civilians to maintain symbolic resistance. The German conduct of the siege was deliberate war crime. The intentional starvation of civilian population violates laws of war. Artillery bombardment of residential areas killed thousands who posed no military threat. Hitler's orders to destroy the city rather than occupy it revealed the racial ideological nature of Nazi warfare in the East. Leningrad's people were to be exterminated because they were Slavs and communists, subhumans in Nazi ideology who didn't deserve to live. The siege's place in Soviet and Russian memory is central to national identity. Leningrad's resistance became symbol of Soviet determination and sacrifice, proof that the Soviet people would endure anything rather than submit to fascism. The city was awarded the title Hero City, the highest honor in the Soviet system. Monuments and museums commemorate the siege. Survivors' stories are preserved as sacred national narrative. The post-siege recovery took years. The city's population had dropped from 3 million to less than 1 million. People slowly returned. Factories were rebuilt. Damaged buildings were repaired. Life resumed, but the scars remained visible. Entire neighborhoods had disappeared. Families were gone. The pre-war Leningrad could never be restored because too many people, who made it what it was, had died in the siege. The survivors' post-war lives were difficult. Many had permanent health problems. The Soviet system provided inadequate support for siege survivors. Their suffering was acknowledged, but not materially compensated. Survivors received small pensions and some privileges, but nothing approaching adequate recompense for what they endured. The state wanted their sacrifice remembered, but didn't want to spend resources supporting them. The siege children, those who survived childhood starvation, carried special burdens. Their growth was stunted. Their education was interrupted. Their psychological development occurred under extreme trauma. Many became successful despite these handicaps. Some became artists and writers who processed their trauma through creative work. Their testimonies provide the most detailed accounts of what the siege felt like from inside. The documentation of the siege is extensive but incomplete. Official records exist but are sanitized, downplaying the worst aspects like cannibalism and the complete breakdown of order during the worst months. Survivor memoirs provide more honest accounts but are necessarily subjective and fragmentary. The full truth about what happened in Leningrad during those 872 days will never be completely known because many witnesses died without testifying. The comparison to other sieges in history shows Leningrad's uniqueness. Medieval sieges killed thousands through starvation, but lasted months, not years, and involved smaller populations. Modern sieges like Sarajevo in the 1990s were terrible, but didn't approach Leningrad's death toll. The siege of Leningrad stands as the most lethal siege in human history. The sustained suffering over 872 days exceeds anything comparable in historical record. The role of the Leningrad civilians in the siege is often overlooked in favor of military narratives. But the civilians were participants, not just victims. They kept the city functioning. They operated factories making munitions. They fought fires. They cleared rubble. They buried the dead. They maintained essential services under impossible conditions. Their contribution to the city's survival was as important as the soldiers defending the hymn. Perimeter got the moral questions about survival during the siege have no easy answers. People made terrible choices to stay alive. They abandoned elderly relatives who were consuming scarce resources. They stole food from neighbors. Some resorted to cannibalism. These actions are understandable given the circumstances, but remain morally troubling. The siege created conditions where normal ethics couldn't apply, where survival required abandoning humanity's civilized norms. The Leningrad siege demonstrates the limits of human endurance and the capacity for survival under conditions that should be unsurvivable. People adapted to starvation rations that medical science says are inadequate for life. They survived cold that should have killed them. They endured psychological stress that should have broken them. The fact that hundreds of thousands survived 872 days of hell proves that humans can endure almost anything if they must. Remember the siege of Leningrad not as statistics about death, tolls, and caloric intake, but as human tragedy of unprecedented scale. 1 million people dying slowly from starvation while surrounded by civilization, while the rest of the world continued normally, while people in other cities ate regular meals and lived in heated homes and worried about problems that seem trivial compared to whether you'll live through the winter. Remember Tanya Savicheva's diary entries chronicling her family's deaths one by one. Remember the musicians too weak to hold instruments playing Shostakovich's symphony. Remember Vincent Coleman, Wait No, Wrong Siege? Remember the mothers who had to choose which child to feed when there wasn't enough for both. Remember the children who watched their parents starve. Remember the old people who refused food so their grandchildren could eat. Remember that the siege was preventable, that earlier evacuation could have saved hundreds of thousands, that better Soviet military leadership could have broken the siege sooner, that Hitler's decision to starve the city rather than capture it was deliberate war crime, that the deaths resulted from human decisions, not natural disaster, that someone chose this outcome and bears moral responsibility for the million dead. Remember that the survivors of the siege carried their trauma for life, that the siege shaped Soviet and Russian identity, that it remains the most lethal siege in human history, that nothing comparable has happened before or since, that 872 days of starvation and bombardment tested human limits and broke them, and somehow enough people survived to tell the story. This is the Siege of Leningrad, September 8, 1941 to January 27, 1944, 872. Days when a city of 3 million was surrounded and starved, when over 1 million people died from hunger and cold and bombs and shells, when the worst of human behavior emerged alongside the best, when civilization nearly collapsed but somehow survived, when people ate sawdust and leather and worse, when children starved and froze and watched their families die, when an orchestra of skeletal musicians performed a symphony to prove that culture survives even in hell, when humanity's capacity for both cruelty and endurance was tested to destruction and somehow barely passed the test.